All right, so thanks very much for the intro, Dan, and thanks everyone for coming today. So as Dan mentioned, I am a postdoc down at University of Melbourne, and today I'm going to be talking about some new data that's come out of my lab looking at the relationship between economic inequality and morality. So when I talk about economic inequality, you see my picture is now very skewed. When I like to talk about economic inequality, what I first like to do is show you what it looks like. So here we have an image from the world's first billion-dollar home, which is in Mumbai in India. So this home is the home to a family of 5. It has a staff of 600 and it towers 27 stories high. In the same city, you'll find yourself here in the Dharavi slums, where you have about 1 million individuals living in 2 square kilometres. So if you go to other parts of the world, for example, South Africa, you might find images like this, where you have sort of relatively affluent homes in quite close proximity to a lot of poverty. And finally, an image you might be slightly more familiar with, something we might see in our CBDs, is something like this, where you have both quite wealthy people and quite poor people living in the same environment. And these all show the many different faces of economic inequality, which I broadly define as the concentration of a majority of wealth in the hands of a minority of the population. So when you have a small few that hold most of the wealth. Now, social psychology has come a far way in describing how economic inequality might affect our psychology. And in particular, social identity theory and self-categorization theory have provided some very informative predictions for how it might affect our psychology. So I'm going to be talking through 3 different hypotheses, and then I will show you how these hypotheses have informed the research that I've done. So first, the fit hypothesis basically says that inequality almost by definition spreads us apart because people have so much, so there's so many differences between people in terms of the wealth that they have. So that then means that the poor become much more distinct from the rich. Those groups are much more separate from each other. This then means that when we categorize people in our environment, it makes it much more easier, much more relevant for us to categorize people in terms of wealth. So this has led to a number of particular outcomes. For example, high inequality is known to be linked to people seeing the world more in terms of wealth, people valuing wealth more, and also people being more motivated to get wealthier. So this then leads to the second prediction, which is the wealth categorization hypothesis, which says that when these differences in society are more pronounced, there should be more frequent intergroup comparisons being made. So when you have these big differences between groups, you should be comparing yourself more to others around you. And by very nature of engaging in more of those comparisons, this seems to enhance us versus them dynamics, this sense that it's sort of one group against another. And so all of this works to sort of affect the social fabric of society, the social relationships between people. And in particular, inequality is known to cause poor relationships between wealth groups. So for example, between the poor and the rich. It's also linked to more negative attitudes towards newcomers. So for example, immigrants. People also tend to trust others less in their environment more generally. People also tend to be less cooperative and more competitive. So this then leads to the third prediction, which is what we call the socio-structural hypothesis. So for this one, what we find is that inequality not only seems to enhance economic instability, but it also enhances this sense of social and political instability. In fact, economic inequality is known to cause what we call a state of anomie, which is a term that was originally often discussed by Durkheim. So a state of anomie really is comprised of 2 different components. A breakdown in the social fabric of society, which generally means that people can't trust each other, people looking out for themselves, and there's also no shared moral standards amongst people. So really about those fractured social connections between people in society. And also a breakdown in leadership, which refers to the sort of leaders in government in society as being ineffective and illegitimate. And these 2 things are thought to feed back into each other and also fuel one another. So both of those 2 things are really important for society to function well. And when we feel like these pillars of society are no longer functioning as they should, we start to feel fearful, uncertain, and insecure. This is a very uncomfortable psychological state for us to be in. So in order to cope with this uncertainty and fear, people will try and take control in an out of control world. So in particular, because of this prediction, past research has found that high inequality is linked to a desire for a popular, strong leader, someone who will come in there and do whatever it takes to regain control over society. So think Donald Trump. Inequality is also linked to greater conspiratorial thinking as a way to sort of make sense of the world, which was otherwise feeling quite chaotic. So this is sort of a broad overview of where the literature is at now. But I consider myself a moral psychology researcher, and one question that I have was, what about morality? Can economic inequality influence morality? And those predictions led us to think that indeed it will. But before I explain why I think it does affect morality, I want to describe what I mean by it. So morality is a very difficult thing to describe, and it's a very confusing area, due in part because moral psychology researchers love a lot of jargon. But I'm going to be talking about this term we call moralization, which is kind of like an umbrella term which we define as increases in the degree to which moral relevance is attached to issues, actions, or entities. And I'm going to break that down a little bit more so that makes sense. So first, you might moralize particular actions. That is, you might make judgments about actions. So for example, I might say, little Billy kicked little Timmy here. How wrong do you think that is? Or how morally wrong do you think this behavior is? And you would answer on a scale, as you can see here on the screen, from not at all wrong to extremely wrong. And so there's two sort of subcomponents of moralization. The first is moral recognition, which is where your sort of judgment about it goes from the non-moral domain into the moral domain. So this idea that it's not at all wrong to being at least a little bit wrong. Then we have moral amplification, which is the sort of increases in the extremity of your judgment about that action. So it's already in the moral domain and you're just making a harsher moral judgment. Now we can also moralize our attitudes about specific issues. So for example, I might ask you, to what extent does your position on abortion a reflection of your core moral beliefs and convictions? And you might answer in this scale as I have here, and you can see how moral recognition and moral amplification plays out in a similar way. Then finally, you can moralize entities, and in particular talk about the moral rights that you think various entities have. So you might say, please indicate the level of moral concern you have for an elephant. And you can fill that out on a scale similar to what you see there. So these are the many different ways that we can think about moralization. And in particular, we think that economic inequality might influence moralization, but in different ways depending on how you look at it. So in part one today, I was informed by this prediction, that second hypothesis, which is that inequality enhances social comparisons and those us versus them dynamics, and it ends up making you sort of trust others less. Now, because of that, we believe that this might reduce the moralization you have for entities. That is, if you can't sort of care or have those positive social relationships with people in your environment, you're probably going to care a lot less for their welfare as well. Now, in part two, we've been informed by that third hypothesis, which is that inequality seems to enhance that sense of social instability, and we engage in those compensatory behaviours that make us feel like we're regaining control. So because of that, we believe that this might actually increase the moralization of actions. So that is, we might become harsher moral judges and have more stringent moral codes as a way to sort of make us feel like we're regaining control over the world. So I'm going to go into both of those in a little bit more detail. But first, I'm going to talk about that part one and the evidence that we have for that. So when we talk about the moralization that we have for entities, often what we refer to are our moral circles. So several scholars have noted that across history, it appears that our moral circles have been expanding out to include more and more entities. So while it was thought that maybe, several hundreds of thousands of years ago, we only sort of cared for our kin and our local tribe, that eventually our care and concern expanded out to include those that weren't in our immediate environment, such as those who are a part of our country, eventually in theory to include those who were sort of all human beings. And also nowadays, we're seeing people care about animals and elements of the natural environment as well. But just because it appears that our moral concern or our moral circles has been expanding out across history doesn't mean that in current times we all have the same large moral circles. So we know that there are many differences between countries in the entities that people do and do not have concern for. And there are also many differences within countries in those entities that people care for. So one way to capture those differences or those individual differences in current times is using the moral expansiveness scale. which was developed by one of my close colleagues, Charlie Crimston, who I believe was here last week. So participants are shown a target similar to this. And they're also given a list of various entities, and they're told to place those entities within their moral circles. So if an entity goes in the inner circle, it means you believe that that individual has the highest moral standing, and then it's your personal responsibility to look out for their treatment. Something falls in the outer circle of moral concern, it means you believe that individual has moderate moral standing. And although you're concerned for their treatment, your feeling of responsibility is drastically reduced. Something falls in the fringes of concern, it means that you believe that entity has minimal moral standing and you don't really feel responsible for its treatment. And then if something falls outside the moral boundary, it means you believe that entity has no moral standing, and almost the idea that you're responsible for its treatment seems nonsensical. So we gave participants a list of 30 entities to place in their moral circles, and these broadly fell into 10 categories. Those who you would typically see as close to you, those that are often seen as in-group members, those that are often revered by society, and those that are seen as out-group members, those that are often stigmatized by society, people we would see as criminals, which hopefully maybe my thing has died. Oh, there we go. Oh, there we go. High sentient animals and low sentient animals, elements of the natural environment, and plants and trees. So in particular, we gave people this list across a variety of cultures, and we had a specific pre-registered hypothesis. And that was, we believe that higher inequality would be related to smaller moral circles, and this would be explained by people having poorer social ties in their environment, in particular by having lower general trust and perceiving greater anomie within their society. So this is the list of countries that we collected this data from, which was 41 locations around the world. And you can see the list of co-authors that assisted in collecting this data. And we measured economic inequality in 3 ways. So the first way was that we got a country level indicator of economic inequality, which is what we refer to as the Gini index. So this is one of the most commonly used indicators of inequality, and it is measured using something we call the Lorenz curve. So the calculation for this is pretty complicated, and I'm happy to describe it at the end if anyone's interested. But the thing you sort of need to take home from this is that this sort of indicator of inequality takes into account the activity of everybody. So those who are poor, those who are in the middle, and those who are rich. Now, that's something important to keep in mind for later. So we got that on the country level. Then the second one we got was a sort of subjective Gini coefficient. And that's because more and more psychological research is starting to realize that people don't perfectly process their environment. Rather, we have these perceptions of our environment that might actually be more predictive of how we behave and how we think. So we asked all of our participants this question here. So we'd like you to think of 100 citizens of your country. How many of these 100 people would in your view be classified as very poor, poor, average in wealth, wealthy, and very wealthy? So our participants then placed those 100 people into those 5 categories. And then with those 5 numbers, we could do some background calculations that ended up arriving at a sort of quasi-Gini coefficient. And again, I'm happy to describe how we sort of calculated that at the end if anyone's interested. So then we also measured economic inequality with a third variable, which is the wealth gap between the rich and the poor. So we very explicitly asked our participants, think about how large the gap is between the rich and the poor. How large do you think it is? And on a scale, very small to very large. So this is a very explicit question about economic inequality, but it also conceptualizes inequality as a comparison between the poor and the rich and really ignores whatever's happening there in the middle. So then for our proposed mediators, we have strength of social ties, including a measure of general trust and perceptions of anomie. And you can see those sort of subcomponents coming out there with anomie within the social fabric and anomie within leadership. So 6 questions each for those. And then finally, our moral expansiveness DV, if one of those entities was placed in the inner circle, it got a value of 3. If one was in the outer circle, it got 2, 1 for fringes and 0 for outside the moral boundary. And so if you add together all 30 of those entities, you get a number between 0 and 90, where 90 represents those who have the largest moral circles. So looking across cultures, this is the average moral expansiveness score for all of those countries. So on this side here, those are the ones with the largest moral circles. And on my, I guess this would be your right, are the ones with the smallest moral circles. So you can see here that the French part of Canada, Turkey and Poland had the largest moral circles, and South Korea, Slovakia and Japan had the smallest moral circles. But it's also worth noting that our intra-class correlation showed us that only 4% of the variance in moral expansiveness can be explained by differences between cultures, which is relatively small. So I'm going to very broadly explain what the results were, but I'm happy to go into any specifics at the end if anyone's interested. So first, what we did was we looked at whether our proposed mediators, those sort of measures of the strength of social ties, related to moral expansiveness. So we found that those who tend to trust others more generally in their environment tend to have larger moral circles, but we didn't find a relationship for perceptions of anomie. But when we broke it down into those subscales, we found that greater perceptions of anomie within the social fabric of society was related to smaller moral circles, as we would have predicted. But there was no relationship to anomie within leadership. So I suppose what this really suggests to us is that it might really be about the quality of those social relationships between people in society rather than any of those other elements, such as the quality of leadership. So we were then interested in whether our IV predicted our mediators and our DV. So does inequality predict the strength of social ties and moral expansiveness? And very broadly speaking, our country level Gini index did not predict anything, nor did our subjective level Gini index. However, our sort of question about that gap between the rich and the poor did consistently predict things. So what we found was that when you believe that that gap between the rich and the poor is large, you tend to trust others less, you tend to believe there's more anomie within the social fabric, and you also have smaller moral circles. So we use that as evidence to push forward with our sort of pre-registered mediation effect. And ultimately what we found was that the higher wealth gap was related to smaller moral circles, and this was mediated by lower general trust. However, it was not mediated by greater perceptions of anomie within the social fabric. That indirect effect, I think, from memory, the p-value is about 0.06. So ultimately what this suggests to us or to my colleagues and I is that trust might be something that really matters for this relationship. And that kind of makes sense to us because trust really does seem to be the glue that binds relationships. And if you can't trust others in your environment, you probably won't care for them either. So there's a couple of sort of nuanced findings in that, and I'm happy to discuss more of those at the end. But for sake of time, I do want to move on to my favorite part of the presentation, which is this second part. So this is where we were interested in whether inequality might increase the moralization of actions. And in particular, does inequality make us harsher moral judges? So like I alluded to earlier, inequality seems to create this sort of social instability. And because we're an inherently cooperative species, we believe that inequality is also, this sort of social instability is like a source of threat to us. So when we have all of these poorer connections between people, when everyone's competitive and not cooperative and not working together, we think these kinds of environments might present as a threat. Now, there's several theories that sort of tell us how we might respond to these environments. So tight loose culture theory suggests that we tighten the norms in society when faced with threat. And that is by desiring clearer social rules and wanting to punish those who deviate from those rules. Likewise, compensatory control theory suggests that we engage in compensatory behaviors when we feel like we have lost control. So those things that make us feel like we're regaining that sense of control. So with all of that in mind, we believe that having a stringent moral code might be one way to tighten the norms of society and make us feel like we're regaining control. And that's because these sorts of moral rules not only provide us with a sense of internal control, that is that it sort of gives us an idea on how we should behave in our day-to-day life, but we also often impose our morals on others, and it's not just how we should behave, but it's how everyone should behave. So it also might serve as a sort of form of external control by dictating how everyone in our environment should also behave. And this might be an effective way for us to deal with that source of environmental threat. So before I talk about the evidence that we have for this link, I also want to briefly touch on this sort of good and the bad of moralization, because I think when we think of the word morals, it often carries a sort of positive connotation to it. But there has been a lot of research now that's shown that it also has a lot of polarizing effects, something that I'm sure we're all familiar with in various parts of the world. So when things become moralized, research has shown that this can lead to quite positive outcomes. So when issues are moral issues for us, it's a massive motivator for action. So we're more willing to go out there in the world and do something about those. So for example, by increasing our political participation and also engaging in collective action. But when issues are also moralized, we're more likely to place ourselves in an echo chamber. That is by sort of gravitating away from people who think different things to us, and then also drawing ourselves towards people who agree with us. We're also less likely to update our beliefs in light of new evidence that might contradict whatever we think. We're also more likely to think that we should achieve our moral end goal through whatever means necessary. So for example, through the use of violence. So all of that sort of suggests that moralization might be one part of the political polarization that we're seeing in many places. So when things become moral issues, this can also be polarizing. So that aside, let's talk about the evidence that we have for this link between inequality and our moral judgments. So there are many different things that we can see as morally wrong. And one way to categorize all of these different things that everyone in the world can see as morally wrong is through moral foundations theory, which broadly places our moral concern into 6 different categories. So we asked our participants to judge how wrong they thought a variety of scenarios were. So the first category or foundation is what we call the harm foundation. And you can see an example of a question or of a scenario that our participants would see there. So someone is being harmed by someone else. The fairness foundation involves scenarios where someone might cheat to get ahead or doesn't get what they deserve. The liberty foundations involve scenarios where someone's freedoms are being oppressed. The authority foundations involve scenarios where someone hasn't respected authority. And the purity ones typically involve situations where someone has done something that individuals might think of as impure or degrading or dirty. And finally, the loyalty foundations refer to scenarios where someone betrays their in-group. So in past research, people have typically looked at these sort of individually, or people often do combine the top 3, which is what they call the individualizing foundations, the ones that are sort of more about the individual. And these are also more typically adopted by political liberals. So liberal in the American sense, not in the Australian sense. Now, the bottom 3 can also be grouped together, and that's what they call the binding foundations, the ones that sort of work to bind groups. And these ones are more typically adopted by political conservatives. But we were interested in our prediction is actually more about people making harsher moral judgments overall. So we also created a combined measure of the harshness of people's moral judgments across all of these scenarios. So first of all, looking across our 41 cultures, you can see how this plays out here. So the harshest moral judgments were made in places like Malaysia, Portugal, Peru, and Uganda. And the sort of less harsh moral judgments were made in places like France, Hong Kong, South Korea, Poland, and Thailand. And our intra-class correlation told us that 13% of that variance can be explained by differences between cultures. And we did see a lot of differences emerging here between all of these cultures for these questions. So in essence, what we found was that, it's all going to come up now, there we go. So no matter which way we measured economic inequality, we found the same relationships. So when there was higher inequality, people tended to make harsher moral judgments. So this was overall when we sort of combined the harshness of their judgments for all those scenarios. It was also for individualizing and binding, and for a majority of those more specific foundations as well. So for example, here's a sort of very broad relationship you can see where on the y-axis we have the average moralization score for each country, and on the x-axis we have that subjective Gini coefficient. So higher values indicate greater moralization or harsher moral judgments, and higher values on the x-axis indicate higher inequality. I should also say that we controlled for all the things you might think are important, like religiosity, political preference, also GDP, and all of those other control variables. So what this sort of suggests to us, this more general pattern of results, is that our relationship here, this relationship between inequality and moral judgments, can't really be explained by judgments that are more specific to inequality. For example, fairness judgments that you might think of as something that would be more closely related to being in unequal places. And it also doesn't seem to be happening just on sort of one side of the political spectrum. So for example, for those individualizing or those binding foundations, rather it seems to be something that's happening overall. So then in study 2, what we wanted to do is look at this in a more realistic setting. And as many of us are probably aware, a place where we often express our moral views is on platforms like Twitter. So we got tweets from 2012 to 2020 from across the US. We got a random 1% of the total Twitter stream, which resulted in 1 billion tweets. And we ran a moral foundations dictionary through all of these tweets, which ended up resulting in about 28 million tweets that contained at least one of the moral words, which is actually quite a lot compared to the sort of hits you usually get with this kind of data. So people are using a lot of moral language on Twitter. So what we could look at is we could look at people's tendency to use any sort of moral words in their tweets. We could look at each of the 5 specific foundations, so harm, fairness, etc. We could look at individualizing and binding foundations. And we could also look at this new category, which is what we call vice and virtue. So vice referring to those ones that are maybe more condemning, such as you've done something bad, and virtue referring to those ones that might be more of a, I guess, a positive evaluation, such as you've done something good. So we got inequality on the place level in the US, which is 1 step below the county level. And so what we found was that high inequality on the place level in the US was linked to more moral content in tweets. And this relationship came out no matter which way we looked at it. So for that total score, for each of those foundations, individualizing and binding, and vice and virtue. Now, some effects were larger than others. So for example, vice was larger than virtue, and fairness was probably the one that came out the most, as you might expect. But broadly speaking, we got the same pattern of results, no matter which way we looked at it. And again, we also controlled for things like religiosity, political preference, GDP, etc., and that didn't change our results. So we also cross-lagged our models and looked at whether inequality at time 1 was linked to moral content in tweets at time 2. And indeed, we found that relationship. So that was also when you control for moral content at time 1 and inequality at time 2, if anyone's familiar with cross-lag models. So one very important note, which you might also be thinking, is that this is a very crude analysis of the kinds of moral language people are engaging in. So because we have 28 million tweets, we obviously did not go through 28 million tweets. So there's going to be a lot of noise in this data. And we cannot also tell, the kinds of moral language people are engaging in. We can't tell if it's people specifically making judgments or if people are using moral language in another sort of form. So then what we wanted to do in study 3 was start to gather experimental evidence for some of the links that we proposed. So we are in the process of sort of designing several more experiments, but the one that we have so far, the results we have so far is what I'm presenting today. So in particular, this experiment looked at the link between inequality and our sort of proposed mechanism of this effect, which is that desire for tighter norms in society. So we got participants on Prolific, and we manipulated inequality to see if this affected a desire for tighter norms in society. And in particular, we use the Bimbula paradigm. So for this, participants are told they're immersed in this sort of fake society called Bimbula. And they're also told that in Bimbula, there are 3 wealth tiers. In the high inequality condition, they're showed these wealth tiers, and in the low inequality condition, they're shown these 3 wealth tiers. So what you can see is the real difference here is that sort of gap between the rich and the poor and how spread out those wealth tiers are. Now, participants are always assigned to be a part of wealth tier 2, which you can see is also matched across conditions. So to make this more of an immersive experience, participants are also told that they have to choose a house, car, and a holiday. So they're shown what all of the wealth tier individuals, though, can choose. So in the high inequality condition, they're shown what group 1 can choose with these sort of very immaculate houses. And group 2 is sort of what they can choose from. And then group 3, you can see here that that's sort of extreme inequality forming there. Now, participants could choose anything from group 2 or group 3, but if they tried to choose something from group 1, it would just say you cannot afford this house. Oh, sorry. There we go. So for the low inequality condition, this is what the participants saw. So you can see that the options for group 2 are matched throughout. But also that those options are much more equal. Now, these are the options for the cars, and these are the options for the holidays, which is a little bit brutal for group 3 in the high inequality condition. So ultimately what we found is that exposure to high inequality related to people desiring tighter norms in their society. So for example, with questions such as, there needs to be more social norms that people are supposed to abide by in Bimbula, and in Bimbula, if someone acts in an inappropriate way, others should strongly disapprove. So these are the questions that we used. So we have a lot of directions that we have to go to from here, and we have, ethics applications for about 6 different studies. So we've got a lot of relationships that we want more direct evidence for here. But to give you an idea about some of the things that we're hoping to find. So I've sort of talked about how people might make sort of harsher moral judgments when they're in situations of inequality. But what we also tend to see with morals is not only do you sort of judge people, but you also might want to punish people. So we're interested in whether inequality is related to harsher punishment as well. So for example, in the sort of social sense, which is how we might police each other's behavior, but also in that sort of criminal sense. So how we treat individuals who have or are going through the criminal justice system. So past research has also consistently linked high inequality to greater political polarization. However, the psychological explanations for this link are underdeveloped, in my opinion. And we think that our work might provide a psychological explanation for why this might be. That if people are moralizing more in high inequality, this might then ultimately have polarizing effects. However, we're in the process of getting more direct evidence for that link. We're also interested in the moralization of specific issues. So is high inequality linked to us moralizing issues more so? So for example, in terms of abortion or things around COVID-19, or also things like the legalization of marijuana. And finally, we're also more broadly interested in this idea that moralization might be a response to environmental threat. So we're also trying to gather evidence, or at least got ethics through to gather evidence, look at how various forms of environmental threat might relate to moralization. So for example, in terms of resource scarcity or climatic threat or pathogen prevalence, and this is something we're hoping to gather in another multinational data set. So a lot to do and a lot of open questions for future research. So hopefully I haven't gone too over time. I would like to thank my many colleagues who have contributed to these projects, one or both of them. And also the individuals from around the world who we couldn't have had such a rich data set without their help. So thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, do please ask. Do I stand here or do I sit down? I guess Yes.
Can I go back to the mediation model you showed?
Yes. Ooh. Got a bit excited there. This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if that held for across individual differences in actual wealth itself, or did people actually wealth kind of moderate?
So our specific participants' level of wealth. So the unfortunate thing about this data set that we had is that while we had it from all of those different countries, they all came from university samples. So there wasn't the sort of difference in sort of, social status or economic status that you might more get if you had like a representative sample from a lot of those countries. We didn't see whether or not it moderated it. We did control for it. So we controlled for subjective social status and the GDP of the country in all of these relationships. But it would be interesting to see if your individual status actually made a bit of an impact about whether or not this relationship existed. I'm not sure, we didn't look at it. Maybe a good direction for future research. Do you expect that it would?
In the real life example, some sort of like at the back end of what's presented, it may be possibly not. Maybe polarization in very different ways, but like, I understand, like if you've got like social state, that's a reasonable proxy for objective, relative wealth level.
Yes.
So,
yes.
So to control that thing,
yeah.
probably
Yeah. Yeah, and like I said, we just didn't quite have the sample either that would make me confident about those effects. So I guess you can kind of see that as like a limitation of that data set that we have, that it's not sort of representative of those countries. I suppose the benefit of it is that our participant pools are sort of relatively, I guess, similar across countries, but what really differs are more of those cultural elements. So it's a bit of a trade-off, but in the data set that we're in the process of getting, we're going to get much more of a representative sample of people, and it's not going to come from university students. So it'd be interesting to see if we get different patterns of results with that. Yes. Let me have a look. Sorry about all of my things. Oh yeah, Thailand being quite low there. Yeah, and on the other graph, why that might be. So this was specifically for the moral judgments, wasn't it? Not moral expansiveness. Yeah. To be honest, we sort of try and avoid, or at least when we're writing out the paper, we try and avoid making specific predictions about certain countries, just because we don't really have the data for it and we didn't look specifically into any countries. I mean, one thing we did find with a lot of these moral judgments is that you can see that a lot of the sort of less harsh judgments are happening in Asia, the Asian countries. That's interesting, and we don't actually know why that is. We haven't looked into that specifically, but that is an interesting pattern that I noticed. And so I suppose Thailand is one of those Asian countries, but yeah, I'm not exactly sure why Thailand would be so low. I just thought it was yeah. I mean, yeah, so all of these as well, so all of these surveys were also translated into the language for each of the countries. And this was all done before I started my postdoc, so I wasn't actually sort of on board when that process was happening. So I don't exactly know about how the wording might have changed. Obviously, I think the instructions would have been to keep it as similar as possible. But that does mean that people might still interpret them differently in different places. Like, you're not going to have the exact English translation in all of the countries. So, yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I was on. I really like the way you did the presentation, but even if it takes longer to like get back to stuff, so like trickling in the content so that we don't get distracted by other stuff on.
Thank you. Even though Dan messed up my one image.
I'm super interested in experimental work.
Yes.
And I guess I'm wondering because so when you're doing what is almost field work in this space, there's so many different possible solutions.
Yes.
Like what's going on.
Yeah.
And so in the mediation what you described, it's just a generalized low level of trust. And I guess it seems like you're positing a psychological mechanism for higher quality of trust, rather than being something about the specifics. Is in the upcoming experimental work, are you going to get even more meaningful, I guess? So even in the experiment you did describe, there is that, like, it's a scenario where it's a nation, people are familiar with ways that inequality is perceived and played out as challenging nations. Like this, I'm trying to imagine what a completely fair group relationship inequality relation from food. That's something right?
Do you mean in terms of making something more simple than what we have with the Bimbula paradigm? So you were just literally comparing two groups and showcasing the difference between two groups?
I'm trying to get away from as soon as you say it's all nations, there's all of that richness of narrative can be applied.
Yes.
Which gets away from a potentially use the alternative mechanisms around beliefs about inequality, beliefs about like why it's what could cause this types of inequality.
Yeah.
About something analogous to the archetypal papers. Do just two groups that are more unequal or not, does that just produce cross papers?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, I would love to get data like that. So I think the reason why the Bimbula paradigm has been used a bunch of times now, and it's been quite successful. All of the times that it's been used, I think that's due to two things. So one is that it's quite immersive and very visual. So you see all of those different elements, as you would have noticed. But also that usually when people measure various outcomes, those outcomes are more to do with Bimbula. So as you would have seen, I didn't ask people, we need clearer social expectations in society. I ask people in Bimbula, we need clearer social expectations. So the questions are usually anchored to Bimbula. And I think that's why the paradigm is so often successful, is because they're put in that context. They're not expecting the sort of incidental effect just from being exposed to inequality. I think any effect that you get there would have to be or you'd need a large sample size, because you would get a small effect from something like that. I can imagine sort of having such an effect. So like, for example, with what you're suggesting, like just seeing two unequal groups and then having people trust others more in their environment, I think would be quite a small effect. So you would need a huge sample size to get that.
Well, in which case, it makes me wonder whether I can understand psychological
How so? How are you interpreting it?
I guess maybe I'll definitely rewatch and go back and look at the original ones, so we might go back to that. But I guess the inequality talked about how it creates an intimate relationship, and then you talked about one of the measures for reduced trust or just moralization, changes in moralization, was just an overall tighter
norms in society.
No, but that the one where you like Stephen Pinker, yes, thank you. The small circle of business.
Oh yeah.
And that's I would like, my prior expectation would be that any the inequality and social categorization impacts of that inequality would lead to distrust across the divide, increases in trust within those groups, because those groups potentially might work together more.
Yeah, right.
And then also whatever is the normative content of those groups that's made salient by that conflict, would they influence our beliefs about moral expansion of morality?
Yeah, right.
So that's a very social psychological mechanism.
Yeah.
And I guess I was not sure what the psychological sounded like we were talking about psychological mechanisms as independent of the ideological changes, from inequality to distrust, tighter,
yeah. So I suppose, just to make sure that I'm on track with what you're saying, would you expect there to be more trust within like your in-group, but less trust between yourself and other groups, or less trust between your sort of wealth group and other wealth groups? Yeah, that was the expected sort of relationship. Yeah.
Coming from, and I just, for example, in the Bimbula experiment, which is that.
Yeah.
There's for the vast majority of respondents, essentially you're painting a picture where there is some villains in one of the societies. There are a certain cadre of people who have allowed rampant inequality to take place.
Yeah.
As a violation of some abstract norm of fairness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the heightened moralization, condemnation, isn't so much. Well, I guess I would entertain it as not so much I'm applying that to everybody a little bit more frequently, but I'm thinking of those villains, and those villains need to get back in line. So that's society.
Yeah. So with that Bimbula paradigm, when we ask the question about desiring tighter norms in society, people might specifically be thinking about the rich, for example, in the high inequality condition. Yeah, I think that could definitely be the case, and something that we want to do, because I have thought about that, like if it's sort of an artifact of people seeing such stark differences and thinking someone's evil, and so we need to reduce that evil in a way, which isn't exactly what we're talking about. And so what we want to show, at least we're getting correlational data showing that actual inequality in the real world is related to desire for tighter norms. So kind of removing those sort of intricacies or those specifics about Bimbula, hoping to get that. But then there's also, I suppose, other inequality manipulations that might be worth looking at. So past research has sort of just shown people different metrics of inequality in their society. So sort of obviously an element of deception there, by saying, things are really unequal in your society, or here's some stats showing that things are relatively equal in your society, and then looking at how that affects people.
You're wrong.
Yeah, well, if you come from somewhere like America, you're probably, if you sort of say, hey, everything's pretty equal here, they'll probably be like, no, it's not. So things like that obviously have sort of difficulties associated with them. So the one that you're thinking of then would be more about just saying these are two groups that are unequal in terms of wealth. How do you feel?
It seems like the message is that there is something more than artifacts of categorization that we would typically expect around. There are intergroup conflicts, there is changes in who one empathizes with, who one is averse to, there is a theory of that intergroup conflict which can change the way that you apply norms and sort of more question. What is and this is why I'm very, I think the experimental evidence, and I love that you're doing both, because so often you really like a research director, and they only do one or the other, and so you either have an experimental sort of stream of research where you have this massive question about whether it's trivial, or the field research where there's something going on here that they can in no way make sort of claims they do, or shouldn't make they do about them.
No, that's what we sort of tried to go for with the mixed method approach. And again, what we're really chasing here is more and more evidence to sort of confirm what we're saying as well, because there are a lot of links in our kind of theory that we haven't directly shown here as well. So we want to get better evidence that actually shows all of those links. So for example, to polarization, to other forms of morality, to punishment, and get better data, I suppose, that supports our theories.
So I think this type of research, so just a broad sort of field is so valuable. I do have some conservative friends that are perplexed that I'm terrible. They're like, oh no, as long as you have the people taken care of with dignity, I can't really guess much better inequality. Allow people to. Yeah, I mean, personal thinking about that's very blind spots. Yeah.
Could the intra-psychological process be that increased inequality leads to increased conspiratorial thinking? So it's like, okay, there's an evil actor. We look at an oligarch. So that's plausible, not just conspiratorial, but the intergroup process will do that who man is. And some of the man is to sorrow, for others the man is to look child. So you can still have the same underlying psychological process. someone is to blame for writing quality, but group belonging dictates who the good man, who resentment is.
Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing that I was thinking. So there might, like, this just might be an exercise like talking about this thing, but actually when you actually
No, this is interesting. I mean, unless anyway.
when you raise the conspiratorial thinking one.
Yeah.
Because I've just been reflecting on how, because I see it actually. But that's my dad's Queensland back a while ago, getting Queenslander. And
So I'm from Queensland as well.
and he's rural, he's Queensland. So I mean, when I see the distrust he has of our institutions, the distrust he has of like experts that I would place a lot of confidence in, like it is I don't see that as I've never really thought about that from like a purely psychological perspective. What I see is they just are not familiar with that community. Like it, and also being in Canberra, I see the complete opposite, where like you cannot swing a cat getting somebody who's a secretary in some department.
Right.
So the idea that there is some, you have like in the government, there's like the secret under government, which is actually running things.
Like the Illuminati or
Yes,
something.
Thank you. Yeah, the deep state.
Oh,
The idea that there is a deep state in any government, when you know how sort of hard it is to coordinate and how hard it is to keep secret, how hard it is to find basic stuff. It's absurd, but then if you're removed from that world, you can entertain those theories. And I guess inequality for me removes large chunks of the population from those worlds. And so, yeah, I think that the relationship you're describing is so useful for demonstrating that problem. It doesn't necessitate a psychological explanation.
Yeah, past research, Joe and I used to be in the same lab. You remember Bruno in our lab? Yeah, has shown that is the one that did the research looking at inequality and linking that to conspiratorial thinking. And the sort of, I guess, like mediated relationship that they found with that was via perceptions of anomie. So that idea that the world is sort of, I guess, descending into chaos. And again, those sort of fractured social ties and the government being ineffective and illegitimate. So that was sort of, I guess, the relationship he showed across maybe like 5 or 6 studies. I'm not sure if that goes with, does that go with your thinking on it, or does that go against your thinking on it?
Very interesting. I guess I would think about them as two outcomes of this, like the single thought. I wouldn't thought about it's one needing to mediate another.
Anomie not needing to mediate.
Yeah.
So inequality causes anomie, inequality causes conspiratorial beliefs, but you wouldn't see necessarily that that's the process that it goes through.
But I need to, obviously that's a whole nother thought.
Yeah.
But it'd be very interesting to look at what is the mechanism that connects anomie, an emotional sense, with a particular way of thinking.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we've gone a bit over time. Are you coming to? Oh,
I have
continue.
Yeah.
Discussion. So just want to say thank you again to Kelly for thanking for us today. So thanks, Kelly.
Thank you.
So as I just mentioned, we're going to go to Badger.